It began in the rose-covered village of Chipping Dean, a place too quiet for something like murder. But on the second Tuesday of May, in a parlour stuffed with faded lace and mahogany, Mrs. Caroline Ashworth was found dead in her armchair, her spectacles still perched on her nose, her knitting fallen to the floor beside her slippers. The doctor, summoned by the maid, muttered something about natural causes until the local constable noticed the faint, peculiar bruise on her neck. An almost perfect semicircle, as though someone had pressed a curved object to her throat. It wasn't until her teacup was found rinsed clean and set back on its saucer, without so much as a fingerprint or smudge, that the police admitted this was no peaceful passing. Something deliberate had occurred, something odd. What puzzled everyone, more than the absence of forced entry or the lack of a scream, was that Mrs. Ashworth had been a woman of no known enemies. Widowed 15 years, she lived alone, save for the maid, Elsie, who was new to service and nearly too frightened to speak. Her nephew, Edward, had visited recently, but the vicar's wife said he was a quiet, harmless soul, more interested in moths and butterflies than in his aunt's modest estate. The only other visitor of note was Mrs. Vivian Turner, a younger woman recently come to the village, who had been seen arriving that morning wearing full widow's black, which struck more than one neighbour as peculiar, since her husband, Mr. Lionel Turner, was not only alive but had been seen the previous week in London, apparently hale and hearty. The whole matter might have dissolved into speculation and rumour were it not for the coroner's report, which revealed traces of digitalis, a powerful and precise poison in Mrs. Ashworth's system. It was this, not the faint bruise, that caused her death. But no medicine bottles were found, and Mrs. Ashworth had no known heart condition. There had been no visitors apart from Mrs. Turner and the postman. The parlour door had been locked from the inside, the windows latched. The only clue, if it could be called that, was a single black feather left wedged in the corner of the armchair, too fine to be from a bird of the hedgerows, one of those long, tapered feathers used in old-fashioned women's hats. But Mrs. Ashworth hadn't worn such hats in years. The villagers murmured their suspicions in huddled conversations outside the greengrocer's and behind cupped hands at the post office. But it was at the Thursday knitting circle that Miss Marple, seated quietly beside the fireplace, pricked up her ears when Mrs. Headley mentioned Mrs. Turner's curious wardrobe. "Black as a crow," the woman sniffed, "and far too soon to be wearing it. Makes one wonder, doesn't it?" Miss Marple said nothing then, only nodded slightly, but the phrase had struck her. Far too soon. That was the kind of thing that didn't sit well in Miss Marple's mind. It was like putting up Christmas bunting in October or serving fish pie on a Wednesday, too early and therefore unnatural. She visited the constable the next morning and asked in her gentle, harmless way whether Mrs. Ashworth had kept a diary. She had. And what a strange little entry it contained the day before she died. Tea with the widow. Odd name, but pleasant enough. She knew about my violets. That was all. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. There was something careful about the wording. Not Vivian, not Mrs. Turner, just the widow. As if the role had been announced, not assumed. Further inquiries revealed that Mrs. Turner had only arrived in Chipping Dean a few months ago, renting a cottage left empty by the Wilkins sisters. She claimed to be mourning her late husband and said the quiet village suited her grief. But when Miss Marple arranged for young Len, the paper boy, to deliver a message to the address she'd given for her late husband's cousin, it came back with an odd reply. Mr. Lionel Turner no longer resides at this address. Which would have made sense, had he not been declared dead. By Sunday, the local police were thoroughly puzzled. There was no proof of forced entry, no clear motive, and no signs of digitalis anywhere in the house. And yet, Mrs. Ashworth was dead, poisoned, and there was a woman in the village wearing mourning for a man who, by all accounts, hadn't officially died. It was Elsie, the timid maid, who provided the final strange detail, though she didn't realize it. She remembered Mrs. Turner's visit the morning of the death. She wore gloves, she said, but not the usual sort, long, almost to the elbow, black lace, very old-fashioned. She carried a little bottle of perfume, I think, though she didn't use it here. Just set it down on the side table for a moment while she leaned close to whisper something to Mrs. Ashworth. Elsie hadn't heard what was said. Miss Marple had, or rather, she imagined it. And sometimes, imagination, when rooted in long acquaintance with human nature, was just as useful as overhearing. She asked to see the bottle. It was gone, of course, but she had a strong suspicion that the gloves, the whisper, the missing perfume, and the clean teacup all pointed to something chillingly elegant, a method that wouldn't leave prints, a poison perhaps hidden in a scented glove or on the rim of a cup wiped with care, a murder enacted by someone who'd prepared for mourning not after the act, but before. And so Miss Marple returned home, sat in her armchair, and waited for the funeral to be announced. She expected, quite rightly, that Mrs. Turner would attend in her widow's black, too early, much too early. On Monday morning, the air in Chipping Dean was taut with something unspoken. News had travelled fast, as it always did in such places, and the village, still reeling from the sudden death of Mrs. Ashworth, now turned its attention to the arrival of someone altogether more unsettling, Miss Marple. To most, she was a gentlewoman of quiet habits and sharp knitting needles. To a few, particularly those who had something to hide, she was the quiet hand that tugged aside curtains others preferred drawn. She returned to the Ashworth house without ceremony, not under the direction of the police, but with the mild confidence of someone who had seen such matters before and had every intention of seeing them through. The house remained sealed under order of the constable, but Miss Marple, with a few soft words and a nod to propriety, was allowed entry under supervision. The constable, Sergeant Braxton, remained in the parlour while she wandered, appearing to admire the furnishings and not much more. But she noticed the faint ring on the side table, left by something that had been removed. A circular base, narrow, smaller than a teacup saucer. The perfume bottle, perhaps? She asked after it. Braxton shrugged. Nothing there when we arrived. Could have been removed by the maid before we got here. Miss Marple doubted it. The girl had been too shaken to think of tidying. If the bottle had gone missing, someone had taken it deliberately. It hadn't been left behind. And what was? More, the pattern of the ring suggested it hadn't been a glass bottle at all, but something made of polished metal, heavy enough to leave a mark. She stood by the bookshelf and ran a finger along the edge. A smear of dust interrupted by a single clean rectangle. A book had been taken recently and suddenly. She turned to Braxton. Did Mrs. Ashworth read much? About plants? Herbs, perhaps? The sergeant, unused to such questions, blinked at her. I wouldn't know, ma'am. Don't think so. She wasn't one for gardening. But someone had taken a book from that shelf. Perhaps not for what it said, but for what it might reveal. Downstairs in the kitchen, Miss Marple found Elsie folding linens with a trembling hand. The girl flinched when Miss Marple entered, but the old woman's voice was kind and slow. You said something about gloves, my dear. Long ones, you said. Was Mrs. Turner wearing them when she left? Elsie shook her head after a moment. No. I know now that I think of it, she wasn't. I remember watching her go, and she waved to the postman. Her arms were bare. Miss Marple nodded as though this confirmed something already settled in her mind. A woman doesn't forget gloves like that. They hadn't simply been removed. They'd been left behind or destroyed, because they were no longer useful, or because they were dangerous to keep. Later that day, Miss Marple made her way to Mrs. Turner's cottage under the pretence of bringing flowers. The woman greeted her politely, a tight smile on her lips, her black mourning dress still in place. The cottage was immaculate, too immaculate. Not a single book out of place, no hint of clutter or habit. Miss Marple took in the surroundings, with the gaze of someone who knew what a lived-in home looked like. This one looked staged, as if it had been dressed for an audience. They spoke of nothing in particular, how peaceful the village was, how spring always brought out the bees, how the old Wilkins sisters had once tried to keep a parrot with disastrous results. But Miss Marple was watching more than she listened. She noticed a faint yellowing along the edge of Mrs. Turner's right thumbnail. Not dirt, a stain, the sort one might get from handling certain tinctures or crushed leaves. Miss Marple didn't mention it. Not yet. She asked if Mrs. Turner had known Mrs. Ashworth long. The younger woman gave a laugh, charming, but practiced. Oh, only in passing. She was kind to me, of course. We had tea once or twice. Miss Marple smiled back. She mentioned you in her diary, you know, referred to you as the widow. Curious, isn't it, how quickly the name takes hold? Mrs. Turner's eyes flicked, just briefly, to the mantelpiece. A nervous glance. Miss Marple followed it, taking note not of the photographs, but of the thin space beside a vase where dust had been recently wiped. Something had once sat there, something taken down and hidden, possibly that same heavy perfume bottle. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage and wrote a short note to the vicar requesting access to parish records. She had a theory, not quite formed but persistent, that Mrs. Turner wasn't the only one playing a role. There was something false in the entire setup. The gloves, the perfume, the widow's black. It had been a costume, a performance. And like all performances, it was meant to conceal. But what? The police, meanwhile, had been fixating on the teacup. Where was it? If it had held poison, it should have been preserved as evidence. Yet the only cup in the room had been cleaned and replaced. Miss Marple suspected that the poison had never touched it at all. It had been introduced through contact, through skin, or through scent. The gloves could have been laced with the extract, or the perfume bottle if it had a hidden compartment. Either way, it was meant to simulate a natural death. Except Mrs. Turner had rushed the stage directions. She wore mourning before the curtain had dropped. That was her mistake. The next morning, the constable received a call from a florist in Market Davington. Someone had purchased a wreath, black ribbon and all, under the name Vivian Turner. But the note attached was unsigned. Miss Marple, hearing this, requested to see the wreath. She was looking not for handwriting, but for the ribbon itself. If it matched the ribbon Mrs. Turner had used when she arrived in the village, it meant she had ordered the mourning arrangements in advance, long before Mrs. Ashworth had died, long before the poison had been detected, and so the noose tightened. But still, there was no proof, only suspicions, only things not quite in place, a missing book, a vanished bottle, a widow too ready to grieve. Miss Marple sat with her knitting that afternoon, looking out at the slow turn of clouds over the Myme hills. She was waiting, not for a confession, but for the next misstep, because with liars there was always another one. The following morning, Miss Marple took tea with Reverend Hargreaves and his wife in the vicarage garden, pretending to admire the rhododendrons while gently steering the conversation toward the funeral arrangements. The vicar, being a man of order, had already begun preparing the service for Mrs. Ashworth, though the coroner had yet to release the body. He mentioned in passing that Mrs. Turner had approached him the day before, asking if she might say a few words during the ceremony. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly at this, not from surprise, but because the gesture confirmed something she already suspected. Mrs. Turner wanted a stage, even in death. She wasn't mourning quietly. She was constructing a narrative, and those who insist on telling their version too soon often hope no one will have a chance to tell the truth. That afternoon, Sergeant Braxton interviewed the principal figures, again this time with Miss Marple quietly present by invitation. It was Mrs. Ashworth's nephew, Edward, who arrived first, tall, bony, and fidgeting with the sleeve of his jacket. He claimed he hadn't seen his aunt in 2 weeks and had only heard about her death through the local postmistress. "We got along," he said quickly before anyone asked. She was generous. Didn't like to talk much, though. When asked about the estate, he blinked and admitted he didn't know the full details. "I believe I'm mentioned in the will, but she'd said something about leaving the house to charity." His voice faltered as he said it. It was a detail that seemed rehearsed, an alibi meant to show disinterest when disinterest itself was suspicious. Miss Marple noticed he never once asked how his aunt had died, not even in passing. Later came Elsie, still nervous but a bit steadier than before. Under Miss Marple's encouragement, she expanded on her earlier account. Mrs. Turner came late morning. I let her in and offered tea, but she said she'd take it in the sitting room with Madam. I went back to the kitchen. I only heard the bell when she left. Did she notice anything odd? Well, the room smelled different, like flowers, but bitter underneath. She looked unsure, but Miss Marple nodded slowly. Like crushed herbs, perhaps. Elsie's eyes widened as though that confirmed what she hadn't dared believe. The sergeant asked if anything had been taken, and Elsie hesitated again before admitting that a small silver bottle had gone missing. It was on the mantel, one of Madam's keepsakes. She used to keep lavender water in it, but it had been empty for ages. It hadn't been empty recently, Miss Marple thought. Or if it had since served another purpose. When Mrs. Turner arrived for questioning, she wore the same black attire and a veil that she kept lowered as she spoke. Her tone was subdued but polished. I was fond of Caroline. She reminded me of my mother. The sentiment, though intended to disarm, struck Miss Marple as strategic. She claimed she had brought flowers that morning, none were found, and that she had left shortly after 10. She was well when I saw her, cheerful even. We talked about a book she was reading, something on botany, I believe. Miss Marple watched closely. "You remember the title?" Mrs. Turner hesitated. "No, just that it had a green cover. A book had gone missing from the shelf. The one about medicinal herbs, perhaps." Miss Marple tucked the note away in her mind. The woman was trying to plant her own detail in the story, without realizing it contradicted the facts. Caroline Ashworth hadn't read about plants. Someone else had. Then there was old Mrs. Mullins, who lived across the road and insisted she had seen Mrs. Turner leave just before 11, looking terribly flustered. The discrepancy wasn't large, but in matters of murder, 20 minutes can be a lifetime. "She had her gloves off," Mrs. Mullins added, "and her hands were red like she'd been washing something out, perhaps something laced with poison. Perhaps gloves soaked in tincture that had begun to irritate her skin. Either way, she hadn't wanted to be seen in that condition." Miss Marple later took a walk with young Len, the paper boy, who had a knack for noticing things. "I saw the Turner lady at the post office last week," he told her. "She bought black ribbon and a sympathy card and asked for it to be posted on Monday. That's odd, innit?" Miss Marple agreed. It was very odd to send sympathy in advance of a death, unless the death had been planned. At dusk, Edward returned, uninvited, to retrieve some of his aunt's belongings. He looked uneasy, caught between entitlement and embarrassment. He made an offhand comment about how strange it was she'd died in her chair. Just like that. When Miss Marple asked how he knew the position of the body, his ears turned red. "Well, that's what the constable said, wasn't it?" he replied quickly. He had not been told. The news had spread, yes, but not that particular detail. He knew too much, or had guessed too well. Miss Marple returned home with her thoughts folded carefully inside her. There was a web now, fine but tightening. At its center was a lie, a small, strategic lie wrapped in charm. She had seen it before. In smiling widows, in dutiful nephews, in helpful witnesses who rehearse their truths too often. The deception wasn't in the loud proclamations, but in the details. The stain on a glove, the missing bottle, the misremembered book. And beneath each falsehood lay a motive. Edward, perhaps desperate for inheritance. Mrs. Turner, perhaps escaping a different past altogether. Even Elsie, frightened and malleable, might have been drawn into something she did not understand. But Miss Marple understood. She always did. Now she only needed to wait for one more contradiction, one more slip, because murderers always talk. And when they do, they say too much. The next morning brought a steady drizzle that soaked the stone paths of Chipping Dean and seemed to dampen the village's already fragile mood. Miss Marple rose early, not for the weather, but because she could feel the pattern of things beginning to form, still faint, but undeniably there. She sat at her writing desk, placing in a line what she knew. A woman dressed in widow's black. Before any death had occurred, a missing silver bottle, a misplaced book, contradictory statements about time and gestures, and a death by poison that mimicked peaceful stillness. But there was something larger hiding behind the method, a reason. That was what eluded her still, and without the motive the pattern remained half-knitted. She began with Edward. On the surface, his presence in the affair was straightforward, the nephew of modest means with a wealthy aunt. But something about his performance struck her as too thin. He had mentioned a charitable bequest as if rehearsed, not as something truly known. If he believed the estate would go to charity, why return so quickly, and why attempt to claim anything at all before probate? Moreover, his knowledge of the death scene, how his aunt had been found in the chair, could not have come from gossip alone. There was no sense of grief in him, only calculation, poorly disguised as awkwardness. Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the solicitor's office that afternoon, under the guise of helping coordinate Mrs. Ashworth's papers. Mr. Sims, the family solicitor, confirmed that a new will had been drafted just 3 weeks before the death. Mrs. Ashworth had decided to divide her estate between two causes, one a trust for widows, the other a botanical research foundation. Edward was to receive a single item, a first-edition book on lepidoptery. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted. "A rare book?" Sims nodded. "Quite. Worth a tidy sum, but not life-changing." She asked whether Edward had been told about the new arrangement. "I don't believe so. The will had not yet been discussed with him. It was to be formalized next week. So Edward had motive, if he had known. But the question was, had he? A clever man might have guessed, particularly if Aunt Caroline had dropped hints. Or he might have assumed, watching her grow closer to others, that his position was no longer secure. Greed, when mixed with uncertainty, often produced rash acts. But Edward had no access to poison, no knowledge of herbal tinctures or how to create the illusion of natural death. That required a more refined hand, which brought Miss Marple to Mrs. Turner. Her story was thin on facts and heavy with flourishes. She had inserted herself into the narrative, clothed in black before the tragedy, a grieving figure without a grave. And what of her husband, Lionel? A discreet inquiry sent to London had returned peculiar news. He was, according to neighbours, in Bayswater, believed to be abroad. But no one had seen him in over 2 months. No official death, no obituary, only silence. Miss Marple suspected that silence might not mean death, but abandonment. A man who left his wife might drive her to shame or revenge. If Vivian Turner had come to Chipping Dean to escape disgrace, she had chosen an odd method. Most people, who wished to disappear, avoided attention. She had courted it. Miss Marple visited the chemist next, a mild-mannered man named Mr. Tate. She inquired, under casual pretenses, whether anyone had recently purchased digitalis or foxglove extract. Illegal without prescription, he said at once. Deadly in the wrong hands. Why do you ask, Miss Marple? She smiled. Just a passing interest in herbs. You see, a friend of mine once confused it with comfrey. Tate frowned. Well, if you're thinking of local collectors, there's only one who's ever asked about distilling tinctures, that Mrs. Turner. Came in a few weeks ago, asking after recipes for home perfume. Miss Marple thanked him and left with her suspicions now rooted firmly. And yet the matter wasn't so clean. If Mrs. Turner had orchestrated the poisoning, what of the other lies? Why the missing book? Why the contradictions in timing? Why was she so eager to step into mourning if she hadn't expected the death? Unless she had not acted alone. Unless, instead of competing motives, what lay before Miss Marple was something more insidious, a shared motive cloaked under layers of separate lies. She returned to Elsie, whose nervousness remained constant, but who had begun to speak more openly in Miss Marple's calm presence. The maid, pressed gently, admitted that she had overheard something curious weeks ago. Madam was arguing with someone, not shouting but sharp voices. I thought it was Mr. Edward, but when I passed by the study, I saw it was Mrs. Turner. Miss Marple leaned forward. Do you recall what was said? Elsie hesitated. Not much, just, Madam said, it wouldn't be proper. I won't help. You lie. Then Mrs. Turner said something about how she wouldn't be judged by a woman who lived in a museum. That, Miss Marple thought, was revealing. Perhaps Mrs. Turner had come to Caroline not as a friend, but as someone seeking cover. Perhaps she'd asked Caroline to help her pass as a widow to escape scandal, and perhaps Caroline refused. That would be motive enough. Not financial, but reputational. If Caroline knew Mrs. Turner was impersonating a widow and refused to keep the secret, it would unravel the fiction Mrs. Turner had carefully constructed. In her world, being exposed might be worse than being arrested. But how did Edward fit into that? He seemed unaware of Mrs. Turner's past. Yet he'd been present during those same weeks. Miss Marple thought back to the missing book. Botanical, possibly herbal in subject. What if Edward had come across it while visiting? What if he too had seen the potential in its pages? Two people driven by different needs, one by disgrace, the other by desperation, could become unlikely partners. That evening Miss Marple sat by her fireplace, her knitting idle on her lap. The rain had eased into mist, and the sound of distant church bells drifted in through the window. She reviewed it all in silence, the stains, the missing items, the false grief, the eager alibis. Each suspect had motive, separate, tangled, and yet converging at the same point. Caroline Ashworth had become the obstacle to both of them. For Edward, she was a shifting will. For Mrs. Turner, a woman who might speak. Both had something to gain from her silence, but the plan had required precision, poison that wouldn't be traced, timing that could create confusion, and a body left in such peaceful repose that it would be mistaken for sleep. It was a clever crime. But Miss Marple knew that cleverness, when shared, always left seams. Somewhere, between the false stories and the concealed objects, the stitch would show. By Thursday morning, the mood in Chipping Dean had shifted. The rain had lifted, but a strange calm had settled over the village, a kind of premature closure. The constable, Sergeant Braxton, came striding down the lane with an unfamiliar confidence, and by midday it was whispered in the bakery that the case was all but solved. Word travelled quickly. Edward Ashworth had been arrested. According to the, constable. Evidence had surfaced pointing directly to him. A gardener clearing out the potting shed behind the Ashworth house had found a torn page from a botanical reference guide wedged behind a flower crate, one that detailed the extraction of digitalis from foxglove, annotated with notes in Edward's distinctive curling hand. Miss Marple was shown the page. and indeed the margin was filled with underlined phrases and a scribbled calculation of dosage. The sergeant also claimed that Edward had attempted to sell a rare book, the very first edition volume that Caroline had promised him, in London, 3 days after her death. The bookseller had reported it as suspicious. It appeared quite damning, a motive tied to inheritance, an early attempt to profit, and now a written link between the poison and Edward's own curiosity about toxic plants. Most in the village nodded along, satisfied that the peculiar murder had been neatly wrapped. Some were even relieved, preferring a quiet nephew-turned-opportunist to the more unsettling idea of a charming widow with secrets and a penchant for dark gloves. But Miss Marple did not join the chorus of agreement. The evidence, while seemingly neat, had the whiff of performance. She returned home with the note in her bag, sat in her usual chair, and studied it again. The handwriting was Edward's, yes, but the note had been too conveniently found, and the page itself was smudged along one edge, as though it had been handled with gloves that had something sticky or oily on them. She recalled Mrs. Turner's gloves, the missing pair, the chemical irritation that had reddened her skin. If Edward had indeed written those notes, it meant only that he had studied something. But what if that page had been planted? It wouldn't be hard to retrieve something he had left behind in the house. Caroline had kept his old books. If someone wanted to redirect suspicion, they need only tear out a page, tuck it into a forgotten corner, and alert the right eyes. The rare book sale, too, gave her pause. Why sell so soon? Edward might be careless, but he had shown some restraint during questioning. Selling it days after her death, before the will was even finalized, seemed oddly brazen, unless it wasn't meant to succeed. Unless someone had nudged him toward it, or worse, taken the book and made the attempt under his name. Miss Marple jotted down a note to inquire whether Edward himself had entered the shop, or if someone else had posed as him. The constable, for his part, was triumphant. "Open and shut now, Miss Marple, you'll see. Young man, pressed by debt, thinks he'll inherit. When he finds out he won't, he takes matters into his own hands." She nodded politely, saying nothing. It was all too fast, too convenient. And the true mark of a clever criminal was not in what they said, but what they allowed others to say for them. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the vicar again. They discussed the funeral, which was scheduled for the following day. Mrs. Turner, it seemed, had volunteered to read a passage from the Psalms. "So touching," said Mrs. Hargreaves. "Such sympathy." Miss Marple nodded again. Sympathy before death. Mourning before mourning. And now, piety before justice. She made her way next to the Turner cottage. The garden was tidier than before. Vivian answered the door with an air of gentle surprise, though her eyes darted behind Miss Marple's shoulder, checking the lane. "I hope I haven't called at a bad time," Miss Marple said sweetly. "I just thought you might wish to talk. It must be difficult, having such sadness all around." Vivian offered tea, though she did not drink it herself. Miss Marple watched her carefully. The woman spoke in measured tones, expressing horror at the idea that Edward could be guilty. "I can't believe he would do such a thing. He seemed lost, not cruel." The sympathy was unexpected, and Miss Marple wondered whether it was genuine or part of a longer script. The truly deceptive, she knew, were often generous in moments of perceived triumph. Miss Marple's eyes roamed the room. A small dish of potpourri sat on the mantel, but there was a faint chemical scent that didn't belong. Something floral, but sharper. Bitter. Like the odour described by Elsie in the sitting room the day of Caroline's death. "Have you been using perfume again, my dear?" Miss Marple asked gently. "It reminds me of something I used to wear in my youth. Rather dangerous stuff. Gave me dreadful rashes." Vivian froze for the briefest moment before smiling. "Just lavender. Nothing. Fancy. Miss Marple nodded but said nothing more. As she rose to leave, her eyes fell upon a familiar object half concealed behind a vase. A silver bottle, narrow-necked, etched in a pattern she remembered from Caroline's mantelpiece. She made no comment then, but she knew what she had seen. That night, she wrote to Mr. Sims again, asking him to check something specific, whether anyone besides Edward had requested information about Caroline's will in the days leading up to her death. And she penned a note to the bookseller in London, inquiring whether the man who sold the rare edition had presented identification or merely a name. The next day, as Edward was led from the holding cell to await formal charges, Miss Marple stood quietly at the back of the small courtroom. She said nothing, but her mind was already 3 steps ahead. The evidence had satisfied the police, but satisfaction was not the same as truth. The real culprit, she knew, was still watching, still calculating. A woman who wore black too soon, who handled bottles too carefully, who prayed over the dead with the calmness of one who had already rehearsed it. And if Miss Marple was right, that woman would not be able to resist one final performance, at the funeral, before the whole village. When grief turned public, it would be her moment to shine, and her moment to slip. The funeral was held on a bright Friday morning, the sun unseasonably warm and golden against the sombre black worn by the mourners. St. Mildred's Church had never looked more polished. Rows of townsfolk filled the pews, whispering soft condolences, though the whispers often gave way to quiet curiosity. Edward's absence due to his detainment had sparked both gossip and a peculiar kind of relief among those desperate for a simple explanation. Vivian Turner arrived 10 minutes before the service began, dressed with precise solemnity, her veil drawn and her posture composed. She took her place in the second pew, just behind Caroline Ashworth's empty front row seat, and bowed her head with the poise of someone used to eyes upon her. Miss Marple, seated discreetly near the back, kept hers fixed on the back of Vivian's head. The widow, if she could be called that, remained still through the prayers, her hands clasped tightly. But it was during the second hymn, when the vicar's voice trembled with emotion, that Vivian slipped a folded paper into her handbag. It was a small movement, easily missed. Miss Marple did not miss it. After the service, the vicar invited those close to Mrs. Ashworth to gather for tea in the church hall. There, amid the clink of cups and the muted scent of scones, Vivian accepted quiet condolences, each one met with a gracious nod or a whisper of thanks. Miss Marple, with practiced ease, drifted near her and offered a small plate of shortbread. Vivian turned, and for a moment their eyes met. Her smile was slight, polite, but not warm. It was the smile of a woman who believed the curtain had fallen. That belief began to shift not an hour later when Miss Marple, seated in the vicar's study with a cup of tea she hadn't touched, read the telegram reply from the London bookseller. Man claimed to be Edward Ashworth. No identification. Well-dressed, mid-30s, wore gloves. Never removed them. The description didn't match Edward. It matched someone else. Someone who understood performance. Gloves again. Always gloves. But more curious than that was the name the bookseller had noted, scribbled into the shop. Ledger, L. Turner. That hadn't been public knowledge. Most believed Mr. Turner was dead. But if someone was using his name... Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Vivian's history, vague as it was. She'd arrived in Chippingdean alone, claiming widowhood, with no documentation and a past cloaked in soft implication. But perhaps it wasn't just grief she was fleeing. Perhaps it was a man, and then, quite unexpectedly, the past stepped forward. It came in the form of an old friend of Miss Marple's, Mrs. Weatherby, who visited that afternoon. Over tea and the creak of a loose floorboard, she recalled something, odd from years ago. There was a case, must have been 8 or 9 years back, down in Wiltshire. A woman had attempted to fake her own widowhood, claimed her husband died in a boating accident, but the man was very much alive. Turned out she'd tried to poison him. Not enough to kill, just enough to make him sick. but he recovered and vanished afterward. Never came forward, poor devil." She paused. "I believe her name was Vivian, too. Vivian Lake or Lane, something like that." The room seemed to freeze. Miss Marple's hands stilled over her teacup. Vivian Lake. The surname wasn't Turner. It had never been Turner. That name was assumed, a convenient reinvention. A mourning veil could conceal a great deal, and a new village was the perfect stage for rewriting history. She made another note, sent a telegram to her contact in Wiltshire, and within the day the answer came. Vivian Lake, once arrested for attempted poisoning, had been released without charges due to lack of evidence. Her husband, Lionel Lake, had disappeared shortly after testifying that the incident was an accident. So he hadn't died. But he had disappeared, which meant one thing. Vivian Lake had learned to survive by erasing the inconvenient past. Caroline Ashworth had threatened that. If Caroline had known, if she had recognized Vivian's true identity, then she had become a threat not because of inheritance or reputation alone, but because she held a mirror to Vivian's true self. And Vivian could not allow that reflection to remain. Miss Marple then reconsidered Edward's involvement. If he was not the killer, could he have been manipulated? What if Vivian, sensing his discontent, had subtly guided him toward the idea that Caroline didn't trust him, that she intended to cut him out of the will entirely? Perhaps she'd even found a way to plant the idea of inheritance slipping away. A shared tea, a gentle suggestion, a reminder of old books left behind. She could have nudged him toward desperation, and then arranged the pieces to make him look guilty. Miss Marple thought back to the torn page, found in the potting shed. The timing of its discovery, the rare book, sold by a gloved stranger, a man's name signed, Lionel's name. Was he alive and helping her, or had she simply used his name as a ghost to shift suspicion? The idea troubled her. If Lionel was alive, and nearby he had not come forward, that could mean fear or complicity. She decided to confront the truth directly. That evening, just after dusk, she called on Mrs. Turner, Vivian Lake, with a box of blackberry tarts and an invitation to walk in the garden. "Sometimes," Miss Marple said gently, "the air helps settle the heart." They walked slowly, between the flower beds, the sky deepening to indigo. Miss Marple remarked on the hydrangeas, on the cold snap predicted for Sunday. Then, without change of tone, she said, "It's such a comfort when the past stays buried, isn't it? I remember a woman, Vivian Lake, I think her name was, who might have agreed with me." Vivian stopped walking. "I don't believe I've ever heard of her," she said after a moment. Her voice was calm. Too calm. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I expect few have. She was very nearly infamous, but things went quiet after her. Husband vanished. I wonder where he is now." Another pause. Then, "Do you know what struck me, Mrs. Turner? The way grief suits you, as if you've practiced it." Vivian looked away. "You're mistaken." "No, my dear," said Miss Marple. Softly, "I'm quite certain I'm not." The woman turned then, sharp and brittle, and something flickered behind her eyes. But it was not fear, it was calculation, as if she were gauging whether to run, deny, or confess. But the garden was quiet, and Miss Marple simply smiled again, like someone settling a shawl around her shoulders. The past had returned, and with it, the truth was stirring. The evening after her quiet confrontation with Vivian, Miss Marple remained by her sitting-room window longer than usual, the warm glow from the lamps inside casting her silhouette across the narrow street outside. She watched the cottage opposite, the one Vivian occupied, where a single light remained on in the parlour far too late into the night. There was no visible movement, only the faint suggestion of pacing shadows. Miss Marple could feel it like a breeze before a storm. The shift in the air when a person realizes their carefully composed story is beginning to fray. But suspicion alone was not enough. The authorities still had Edward, and Vivian knew that. No doubt she believed the matter nearly closed, despite Miss Marple's veiled reminders that some people remembered everything. But Miss Marple wasn't finished. The next morning she went to the vicarage not for scripture or sympathy, but for a piano. The vicar's wife had one in the sitting room, a polished upright, rarely used now except for the occasional hymn. Miss Marple asked if she might borrow it briefly that afternoon. "I've always found music tells a great deal about a person," she said lightly. The request, odd as it sounded, was granted without question. That afternoon, with a tray of jam tarts and 2 cups of tea, Miss Marple invited Vivian over for what she termed a little closure. The widow, dressed again in mourning black though her gloves were absent today, accepted. She was wary but not suspicious enough to refuse. Miss Marple's demeanour had returned to its most charmingly harmless register. Light chatter, small talk, and apologies for the draught in the hallway. She offered a seat, poured the tea, and suggested that perhaps Vivian might help her with something trivial. "I've forgotten the melody for a hymn," she said, sitting at the piano. "The day thou gavest, Lord, is ended. You must." "Know it. We sang it at the service." She played a few bars, badly off key, and turned with a flustered smile. "Would you try it? I believe you have a lovely voice." Vivian blinked, caught off guard, but acquiesced. She sang the first few lines, softly, confidently, no hesitation in her tone. Miss Marple joined in, her own voice trembling just enough to ensure she was no threat. Then halfway through the second verse, she paused and asked, "Do you remember Caroline singing it at all?" Vivian faltered. "Caroline?" "Yes, at the Evensong 2 weeks ago. She sang it quite clearly, though. I remember you said she didn't like hymns much. Funny how that slipped your mind." Vivian blinked again, and the note she tried to continue fell flat. Miss Marple let the silence linger. The piano had not been for music, it had been for control. Miss Marple had wanted Vivian off balance, drawn into a task she hadn't expected. The human voice she knew betrayed more than most people realized. When Vivian faltered on the hymn, her hands tightened in her lap. Not confusion, defense. Her reaction wasn't that of someone caught in a simple mistake. It was the reaction of someone realizing she had slipped in her own falsehood. "You said you barely knew her, Vivian," Miss Marple continued gently. "But you knew her well enough to spend time in her sitting room. You knew which teas she liked, which books she didn't read. You told the police she talked about a green-covered book on botany, yet we both know she had no such interest. And when Elsie described your visit, she remembered your gloves, until they disappeared." Vivian straightened but said nothing. Her face was calm, eyes composed, but Miss Marple had already seen what she needed to see. She pressed further. "I found something curious in my garden this morning. A broken glass dropper, half buried, under the lilacs. Most unusual. It's not mine, of course. But I remembered Caroline used to keep one in that silver bottle on her mantelpiece. The one that went missing. I imagine whoever had it might have disposed of it in a hurry, when she realized she'd been seen with it more than once." Vivian's jaw tightened, still silent. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "I know Edward didn't kill Caroline. He's vain, careless perhaps, but not capable of that kind of planning. And you, well, I think you knew exactly what you were doing. Poison is a woman's method, as they say. But the staging, the mourning dress, the perfume bottle, those were theatrical touches. You wanted us to believe the lie before the body was even cold." At last, Vivian spoke. Her voice was calm, almost scornful. "You have no proof," Miss Marple nodded. "No, not yet, but I have something better. You've been playing a part from the beginning, haven't you? The grieving widow, the pious guest, the helpful neighbour. But you see, it's tiring, isn't it? Keeping all the pieces straight, the book, the time of the visit, the story about the hymn. And now, your voice. It cracked at the wrong word. Vivian stood abruptly. I should go. Miss Marple rose too. Of course. But before you do, I should mention that the inspector will be by this evening. He's bringing the bookseller's signed ledger and a photograph of Lionel Lake. I wonder if he'll look like the man you sent to sell the book. Vivian turned sharply. Her composure wavered for just a breath. He's dead, she said. Is he? Miss Marple said gently. Or is he simply somewhere you needed him to stay silent? Vivian left without another word. That evening, as the sun sank and long shadows fell across the village, Miss Marple sat again by her window. Across the lane, Vivian's cottage was dark for the first time since her arrival. No lamplight, no motion, just quiet. Sometimes the truth didn't need a courtroom or a confession. Sometimes all it needed was one crack in the mask. The following morning, Miss Marple awoke to the news that the potting shed behind the Ashworth house had burned during the night. A smouldering ruin now stood where garden tools and old flour crates had been stacked only a day earlier. Sergeant Braxton arrived at the scene just after sunrise, rubbing sleep from his eyes and muttering about local boys and matches. But Miss Marple knew better. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't mischief. It was timing, surgical, precise, and unmistakably intentional. The shed had been locked for weeks and had no electricity running to it. A broken oil lamp had been discovered in the ashes, its metal warped, the glass gone. The cause was recorded as accidental, but Miss Marple, standing quietly near the vicar's wall, saw the truth plainly. Someone had returned to erase something they had missed. Perhaps that torn botanical page had been planted more hastily than intended. Or perhaps something else had been left behind, a clue overlooked, too dangerous to risk. Now it was ash. Word spread quickly through Chipping Dean. To most villagers, it was merely an unfortunate coda to a sad tale already settled. Edward remained in custody, though no charges had been finalized. Vivian, now reclusive, had not been seen since the funeral. She'd closed the shutters on her cottage and told the vicar's wife that she needed time for quiet prayer. But to Miss Marple, silence from Vivian was not retreat. It was strategy. Later that day, she visited the constable to inquire whether any of the evidence taken from the house had been re-examined. There wasn't much, Braxton admitted. That teacup was wiped clean, the gloves were never recovered, and now the potting shed's gone. That torn page was the only solid thing we had. Miss Marple nodded, pressing gently. And the ledger from the London bookseller? Braxton frowned. Still in transit. Inspector said he'd bring it when he returned from London tomorrow. She knew she had little time. That evening, she took a cautious walk past Vivian's cottage. No light glowed from the windows. The curtains were drawn. But she noticed something strange. The scent of smoke still hung faintly in the air. Not just from the shed, but newer, sharper. As she passed the garden gate, she saw a small metal pan beside the rubbish bin, blackened at the edges. Burnt paper clung to the bottom like a scorched shell. Someone had tried to destroy something else, and not far from the house. She didn't approach the bin directly, but later, under cover of darkness, young Len was sent on an errand to collect a pan Miss Marple left behind by mistake. He returned with it wrapped in cloth. The pan was indeed used to burn paper. Charred flakes remained, fragments of handwriting visible under soot. Miss Marple used a pair of tweezers and a magnifying glass to inspect the remains. One scrap still held part of a signature, L.L., followed by what looked like the start of Ake. Not enough to prove anything, but enough to know what had been destroyed. Vivian had begun cleaning house, literally and otherwise. The next morning brought another blow. The vicar received a letter from Vivian Turner announcing her sudden departure. "I feel it is time I return to my family and resume a quieter life in Dorset," it read. No forwarding address, no mention of farewells. By noon, the cottage was empty. Only a pressed flower bookmark had been left behind on the bedside table, carefully placed in a book of hymns. Miss Marple picked it up herself. Foxglove. The timing couldn't be ignored. With the inspector due back the next day, Vivian had chosen to vanish one day too soon. She'd known. Someone had warned her. The notion troubled Miss Marple. Someone within the village, someone close enough to the investigation, had tipped her off. Sergeant Braxton was no fool, but neither was he immune to charm. Vivian had known how to perform, how to play the innocent, the bereaved, the spiritual. If she'd planted an idea in his mind, a quiet suggestion that she was being harassed or unfairly watched, he might have tried to protect her. Unwittingly, Miss Marple didn't accuse him. That wasn't her way. Instead, she thanked him for his help and returned home, her mind already racing. The ashes in the shed, the burned note, the timing of the departure, all threads pointing towards someone desperate to keep the past buried. That night, Miss Marple sat down and wrote 2 letters. One to Inspector Hadley, alerting him to Vivian's flight. The other to a private contact she hadn't used in years, a retired railway porter in Dorset, who now worked part-time logging arrivals at the local station. She asked him to watch for a woman travelling alone, possibly under a different name, dressed modestly, carrying little, and looking for long-term lodging. She included a description: mid-30s, neat posture, face composed but eyes too alert. By morning, her nerves were taut. Without Vivian, the case lacked a physical presence. The villagers, already uncomfortable with scandal, were eager to forget. But Miss Marple had no intention of allowing the truth to smoulder like the potting shed. She needed to shift the ground, beneath the story, and fast. She went to see Edward. He looked thinner, tired, and more confused than ever. "They said I'll be let go soon," he muttered. "No charges. But people look at me like I did it, like I'm capable of—" He trailed off. "I didn't even know what foxglove was until all this." Miss Marple studied him. "I believe you. But I also believe someone used you, Edward. Someone who knew you'd be the perfect distraction." She lowered her voice. "Did you ever meet Vivian Lake before this?" His brow furrowed. "Lake?" "Her real name." He stared for a long moment. Then slowly he said, "There was a woman, years ago, stayed at a hotel I worked at in Wiltshire. Said her name was Mrs. Lake. Charming. Polite. She and my aunt had tea there once. But that was years ago. And there it was." Vivian had known Caroline before, not recently, not casually, but long enough ago that Caroline could have recognized her. And if Caroline had recognized her and refused to lie on her behalf, again, it explained everything. The murder hadn't been impulsive. It had been a silencing, and the case had just lost its best witness. Miss Marple left the station in silence, the weight of vanishing evidence pressing heavily on her shoulders. Vivian was gone. The proof was ash, the motive nearly obscured. But there was one card left to play, and Miss Marple was preparing to use it. The inspector returned to Chipping Dean late Saturday afternoon, looking travel-worn but alert. He carried a slim briefcase, heavy with new information, and met Miss Marple privately in the vestry of St. Mildred's before visiting the constable. "The bookseller confirmed it," he said quietly. "The ledger's signature was L. Turner, but it's not Edward's hand. It was traced. A forgery. No identification was shown." He opened the case and produced 2 photographs. One, an old press clipping of Vivian Lake. The other, her more recent likeness taken from a driving license. Application under the Turner alias. Same woman, no doubt. Miss Marple nodded, the confirmation not a surprise but a necessary piece. "She's gone," she said. "Vanished yesterday, and someone helped her do it. I suspect she's not far, but she won't stay long. She burns everything she leaves behind." Hadley exhaled through his nose and looked at the second envelope. "There's more. Dorset police picked up Lionel Lake this morning, alive and well, working under the name Gilbert Lee. He walked into a clinic for an eye complaint, and the nurse recognized him from a bulletin we issued yesterday." He paused. "He says he's terrified of her, claims he's been hiding for years." Miss Marple's expression barely shifted, but her mind was already running ahead. So she knew he was alive, and she used his name to frame someone else. "She may have thought he'd stay hidden forever," the inspector said. "She may have intended to kill again." The words settled heavily in the quiet church room, and then, as if summoned by those very words, a boy burst into the vestry, Len, the paper boy, breathless and wide-eyed. "Miss Marple, come quick, someone's broken into your house." By the time they arrived, the front window had been smashed. A few ornaments knocked over. The desk drawers were open, contents spilled across the carpet. But nothing was taken, at least not in the ordinary sense. It was what had been searched for that mattered. Miss Marple stepped through the wreckage, eyes moving carefully from the curtains to the hearth, and then to the waste bin. It had been emptied. She opened her sewing basket. The small envelope where she kept pressed foxglove petals, gone. A single scrap of burned paper remained. "She wanted to know how much I had," she murmured. She panicked. Hadley bent to inspect the scene. She must have doubled back. If she felt the police were closing in, she tried to erase whatever. "You hadn't already shown." Miss Marple looked out the broken window toward the darkening lane. "She's not running anymore. She's circling." The following morning brought the second blow. Elsie, the maid, failed to arrive at church. By mid-morning, the vicar's wife mentioned that Elsie's cousin had come to call and found the girl's room empty, her belongings still there, her coat missing. Hadley was quick to mobilize the constable. Miss Marple, however, remained still, for a long time, seated on the edge of a pew in the quiet of the nave. "Vivian never believed Edward would be convicted," she said slowly. "He was never the target, only a shield. And when that shield began to crack, she had to act again. She killed the only other person who could place her with the victim. That morning," Hadley said grimly. "Elsie." Miss Marple didn't reply. She stared at the stained glass window above the altar, watching the shifting reds and blues on the stone floor. "She hasn't killed her. Not yet." The inspector turned to her. "She needs her," Miss Marple said. "Elsie didn't just witness something, she carried something Vivian didn't realize until too late. Memory, details, timing. You don't destroy a ledger when you might need to correct it. You don't silence a witness without knowing what they've told." The inspector narrowed his eyes. "You think she's trying to find out what Elsie knows?" "I think she's afraid Elsie may have remembered something she missed. Something small. And when you build your world on lies, even a small truth can bring it down." Search parties were organized within the hour. The lanes were combed. The old mill inspected. Even the fields behind the school searched. No trace. The only sign was a loose button found in the woods, near the narrow bridge over the stream, snagged on a branch, torn cleanly. It was navy blue, not from Elsie's coat. "She's wearing a disguise," Miss Marple said softly. "She's changed again." That night, Chipping Dean felt different. The quiet had sharpened, grown unnatural. No footsteps on gravel paths, no lights left on in parlour windows. People stayed home, curtains drawn, and Miss Marple, as was her habit, sat once again by her front window, but this time with a walking stick beside her chair and the kettle never far from boiling. If Vivian was desperate enough to return once, she might do so again. The inspector remained close. He refused to leave the village that night, and it was just before midnight when a cry rang out from the baker's cottage, then silence. By the time Miss Marple and the inspector arrived, lanterns bobbing ahead, the back door had been forced open. In the pantry they found the baker's wife unconscious, her head bleeding, but alive. And beside her, tucked inside a storage barrel, tied, but unharmed, Elsie. She came in from the back, the baker's wife said weakly. Said she was cold, wore a shawl. I didn't recognize her until she was too close. Vivian had struck again. Not to kill, but to extract. She had tried to silence Elsie, perhaps scare her, perhaps bribe her. And when the girl refused to speak, she'd lashed out, but left her alive. A miscalculation, a rush. She'd been startled by something, or someone. She's slipping, Miss Marple said quietly as the inspector knelt beside Elsie. She's been careful all along, but now she's acting on fear, and fear made people careless. Vivian hadn't vanished. She was still here, and now she was running out of time. By dawn, the village of Chipping Dean felt like a wound trying not to bleed. Doors stayed locked, telephones rang unanswered, and even the crows that normally shrieked across the vicarage field seemed subdued. Elsie had been moved to the vicar's guest room under quiet watch. Though frightened and shaken, she had spoken a few halting sentences to the inspector just before falling into a fitful sleep. She kept asking what I saw, what I remembered. She was angry that I couldn't answer. Miss Marple stood nearby, her hand resting lightly on the bed frame, her thoughts tangled in the stillness. Something about that line, it gnawed. Elsie couldn't give Vivian an answer because she didn't know what she had seen. Not truly, not yet. And that meant Vivian was chasing a ghost, a memory not yet fully formed, which meant Miss Marple thought that the girl had seen something small, something overlooked. She stepped outside into the chill morning air and walked slowly back to the Ashworth house, now shuttered and sealed. The garden remained wild, the gate still half off its hinges. Beyond the back path, the ash remains of the potting shed were barely smouldering anymore. It wasn't the destruction that called her back. It was the absence. Something had vanished there long before the fire, not just the torn page or the tools. An arrangement had been disturbed, some order broken. She crouched near the fence and stared at the earth. Foxglove still grew nearby, its blooms now shriveled. She traced her fingers through the blackened soil, and her mind spun backward. To the tea service, the scent of perfume, the missing gloves, and the vanished silver bottle. To the green-covered book no one had ever found. Then to Vivian's voice at the funeral. Then, as if unlocked by some quiet whisper, to a single, offhand remark made by Caroline Ashworth's neighbour 2 weeks earlier. Funny woman, Caroline. Never trusted banks, you know. Used to say if you wanted something kept safe, put it where people least expect it. In plain sight. Miss Marple rose slowly. In plain sight. She returned to the house, walked around to the front, and asked the constable if she might see the parlour once more. Quickly, she said. I won't disturb anything. Braxton hesitated but nodded. The door creaked as they entered. The armchair still stood in its place, the teacup on the saucer, clean and undisturbed. Her eyes passed over the fireplace, the mantelpiece, the cracked photo frame, and then, at last, stopped on the bookshelf. The book. The one that had supposedly gone missing. The green one about botany. It wasn't missing. It had never been missing. It was simply turned backward, spine in, pages out, mismatched, hidden in full view. She pulled it from the shelf. It was heavier than expected. Inside, The middle pages had been hollowed out, crude but precise, and nestled within was a small cloth pouch. She opened it. A pair of gloves, black lace, folded neatly, and beside them, the silver bottle. Not the bottle Vivian had used, the real one. Caroline's. She stared down at it in silence. Vivian hadn't taken the bottle. Caroline had hidden it. Miss Marple turned slowly, her heart beginning to knock more sharply in her chest. This changed everything. Back outside, she didn't speak at first. She walked the lane slowly, allowing thoughts to settle into place like pieces falling into a puzzle's frame. Vivian had come to silence Caroline, yes, but she hadn't expected resistance. She hadn't expected the older woman to suspect her. But Caroline had suspected something, perhaps not murder, but dishonesty. Maybe she'd recognized Vivian as the same woman from Wiltshire. Maybe she'd noticed the change in name, the forced familiarity, the tension behind the charm. And so she'd prepared. Miss Marple returned to the vicarage where the inspector waited, leaning on the wall near the rose bushes. She handed him the book and pouch without a word. He opened it and let out a soft breath. "You found it. This proves she was here, that she was lying." "No," Miss Marple said quietly. "It proves." Caroline knew she was lying. And then it came together. The gloves had never disappeared. They were removed by Caroline and hidden. The bottle, too. That was why Vivian had searched Miss Marple's house so frantically. She'd believed Miss Marple had found Caroline's hiding place, but she hadn't, because the clue was so simple, so plain. A backwards book on a shelf, of tidy spines. Caroline, methodical to the end, had turned it just enough to be wrong, just enough for someone truly looking to find. She never trusted banks, Miss Marple said again. But she trusted the ordinary. If you wanted to hide something, you left it where nobody would touch it, and she was right. The inspector was already moving. "I'll alert the train stations. If Vivian tries to flee again," Miss Marple interrupted. "She won't." He turned. "You think she's still here?" "She hasn't left," Miss Marple said softly. "She was close enough to break my window, close enough to try and question Elsie. She's waiting, watching. She's cornered," Hadley said. "She's desperate." "No," Miss Marple replied, her eyes narrowing as she looked toward the rising sun over the cottages. "She's calculating, she's waiting for the right moment. But now, we have something she didn't expect. A pattern." She looked back at the inspector. She moved quickly after every slip, every time someone remembered something or found something or doubted her, but each move left a trace. The foxglove in the hymn book, the signature in the shop ledger, the false tears at the funeral, the broken window. She doesn't erase her trail. She builds a new one to cover it. But now, with the book, we have both trails, the false one and the one Caroline left behind. The inspector nodded slowly. "We can set the trap." "She'll come for it," Miss Marple said. "She has to. That bottle is the last thread she can't afford to leave behind." And now Miss Marple knew precisely how to wait. The trap was simple, unassuming, and entirely in keeping with Chipping Dean's quiet rhythm. Miss Marple returned the green book to the Ashworth parlour, placing it back on the shelf in the exact backwards position where Caroline had hidden it. But this time, the silver bottle and gloves were gone. In their place, she slid a small sliver of mirror into the hollowed space, angled just enough to reflect movement from the room behind. Then she locked the parlour door, handed the only key to the inspector, and arranged a plan. They would not wait in the house. They would wait beside it, at the gardener's shed, through a shared garden wall, where they could watch without being seen. Patience, Miss Marple had always said, is the weapon the guilty can't afford to use. It was nearly midnight when the parlour window creaked. She came through the back, dressed in brown instead of black, her hair tucked beneath a modest scarf. No veil now. No drama. Just a woman with too much at stake and no more time to run. Vivian moved like someone unlearning fear, someone stepping back into a place not with caution but with resolve. She didn't hesitate. She walked straight to the bookshelf, pulled the green book free, and flipped it open. When her fingers met the mirror instead of the gloves, she froze, but only for a moment. Then she slammed it shut and turned, but the parlour door had already swung open. The inspector stood just beyond it, Miss Marple behind him. Vivian didn't speak. She didn't flinch. She simply placed the book on the desk and sat in Caroline's old chair as if she'd been invited. Miss Marple stepped forward slowly. "It's over," she said gently. "We know who you are. We've spoken to Lionel. We've recovered what Caroline hid. There's nowhere left to burn, Vivian." Still, Vivian remained calm. Her voice, when it came, was level. "So you've pieced it together. I suppose congratulations are in order." Miss Marple lowered herself into the opposite chair, her hands folded. "Not quite yet. The pieces were never the puzzle. Only the outline. What I still don't understand is why. You didn't kill for gain. You didn't need money. Caroline wasn't going to disinherit you. You weren't even mentioned in the will. You weren't angry. You weren't spiteful. You came here already prepared to grieve. You wore mourning clothes before the death. You expected to kill her, but you liked her." Vivian tilted her head. "Is that so?" "You were seen smiling with her," Miss Marple continued. "Elsie remembered. You were laughing together the day before. That's what frightened her the most. You were warm, easy, and yet you knew you'd already decided to kill her. That's what doesn't make sense." Vivian's lips curved faintly. "She recognized me. She did. She threatened to expose me. She refused to lie for you," Miss Marple corrected. "But she wasn't going to report you. Caroline never went to the police. She simply didn't want to be part of the illusion." Vivian turned slightly in the chair, looking toward the window. The night outside was still. The wind had died down completely. "You think it was just about my name, about pretending to be someone else?" Miss Marple waited. Vivian looked down at her hands. When Lionel left, he took more than his suitcase. He took the version of me that made sense. I wasn't the first woman to be left. I wasn't even the first to be lied about, but I was the first to be erased in my own story. He told everyone I was unstable, said I made it up, said I'd threatened him. I was laughed out of court, out of the press, out of my circle. I couldn't get work. I couldn't be seen. So I changed my name. And I changed my story. I created Vivian Turner, the grieving widow. Because a widow is respectable. A widow is pitied. Miss Marple nodded slowly. But Caroline knew that wasn't true. Vivian's voice dropped, almost inaudible. She saw me, the real me. She remembered Vivian Lake. She asked me what happened, and I told her. I told her the truth. I expected sympathy, maybe even quiet, understanding. Instead, she said, "We all live through shame, my dear, but lies are how we make others carry it for us." Miss Marple's breath caught. "I asked her to protect me," Vivian whispered. "I begged. She said no. She said the only thing that makes a name mean something is if you wear it honestly." I hated her for that. Not because she exposed me, but because she believed I could survive the truth, and I knew I couldn't. Not again. Miss Marple sat back in her chair. The room was silent, save for the ticking of the old mantel clock. It was not madness. It was not greed. It was erasure, fought with performance. Vivian hadn't killed to gain. She had killed to exist on her own terms. "You thought if she was gone," Miss Marple said gently, "the past would stay buried." "She was the last witness to who I'd been," Vivian said, "and I wasn't strong enough to be both." Outside, the inspector said nothing. The gravity of what had been confessed rested heavily in the air. Miss Marple stood. The truth has a way of remaining, even when we think we've burned it. In books, in bottles, in frightened maids and turned spines. You buried yourself. Vivian. All Caroline did was refuse to bury the lie with you. Vivian rose slowly. She didn't struggle when the inspector approached. She didn't plead. She simply walked out of the parlour, through the garden, into the dawn. And Miss Marple, left in the stillness of the room, gently turned the green book on the shelf so its spine faced out once more. The morning light filtered weakly through the ash-grey sky as Chipping Dean stirred, unaware that the final threads of the quiet storm unravelling in its midst were about to snap. Vivian Lake, Vivian Turner, had not yet been arrested. The inspector, though confident in the strength of the case, agreed to Miss Marple's request for one final measure before taking her in. There was still a truth Vivian hadn't spoken, something that had clung to Miss Marple since the night, in the garden, when Vivian hadn't run. She had simply looked tired, not cornered. It wasn't guilt she was burdened by. It was a kind of resignation. Miss Marple requested that she be allowed to speak to Vivian one last time. Not in a cell, or a courtroom, but somewhere that wouldn't feel like a trap. They chose St. Mildred's. The vicar's study, to be precise. A narrow room lined with well-thumbed theological volumes and the scent of pipe smoke clinging to the curtains. It was quiet, small, and private. Miss Marple waited there, seated at the vicar's desk, the green book lying closed before her like a final line drawn in the sand. Vivian arrived without handcuffs, escorted discreetly by the constable, her scarf wrapped tightly at her neck and her gaze steady. She took in the room with a glance, then lowered herself into the wooden chair opposite. "So," she said softly, "you've won." Miss Marple didn't answer. She simply pushed the book forward until it rested between them. "Caroline hid this not to stop you," she said, "but to leave a message. She knew what you were, but more importantly, she knew who you were." Vivian's eyes flicked to the book, then back. "I know what you're trying to do," she said quietly, "but I've told you everything. The name, the fear, the shame. What else do you want?" Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "I want to know what you were really trying to destroy." Vivian blinked. Miss Marple went on. "You weren't trying to escape Caroline's memory. You were trying to erase her kindness. You hated her most for seeing you clearly and yet still treating you with respect. Because if she had judged you like everyone else had, it would have made it easier to justify what you did. But she didn't. She made you tea. She listened. She looked you in the eye. That's what made you feel small. That's what made you act." Vivian's hands trembled for the first time, just slightly. "She didn't threaten you," Miss Marple continued. "She made you feel seen, and you couldn't bear it. Because if someone good saw the real you and still disapproved, then it meant you couldn't blame the world anymore, and you needed someone to blame, didn't you?" Vivian looked down, her fingers tightening in her lap. "You think I don't know that," she said, her voice sharp. "You think I haven't spent every night trying to believe I had no choice, that Lionel ruined me, that it was only survival." Her eyes lifted, and for a moment the performance dropped. "I wanted her to hate me," she whispered. "When?" I saw her face after I confessed. So calm, so disappointed. It made me feel like I'd already disappeared. I needed her to turn away, but she didn't. "And that," Miss Marple said gently, "is why you killed her." Vivian closed her eyes, not because she exposed you, but because she refused to condemn you. The room was very quiet. Then, from far down the hallway, the sound of the church clock chimed 11. Miss Marple didn't move. Vivian stayed seated, frozen in a silence that had the weight of finality. The inspector stepped quietly into the room then, saying nothing. Vivian looked up at him and then, at last, stood. "I won't resist," she said simply. As they turned toward the door, Miss Marple said one last thing, softly, almost to herself. "You wore the widow's black before the death, not because you were preparing for a murder, Vivian. You were preparing to grieve the person you couldn't be." Vivian paused at the threshold. For the first time, something close to sorrow passed over her face. Not for what she had done, but for what had once been possible. Then she walked away, the green book left untouched on the desk. Outside, the village stirred with its usual rhythm. Carts on the road, children by the bakery, sparrows scattering from the hedges. Life resumed gently around the outline of tragedy, and in the stillness of her parlour, Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, her fingers steady, her thoughts quiet. The pattern, once obscured, had finally revealed itself, not just in threads of clues and motives, but in the fragile stitches of human longing. And this time, the unravelling had stopped before another life could be lost. A week had passed since Vivian Turner, or rather Vivian Lake, was quietly taken from Chipping Dean in the back of the inspector's motor car. The village settled again, like dust after a gust of wind, disrupted, disturbed, but not destroyed. The talk in the bakery softened, the whispers in the church pews dwindled. Miss Marple received warm nods from those who had previously doubted her quiet suspicions. Even Edward, pale and drawn from his brief ordeal, had resumed his weekly visits to the greengrocer with a humble kind of caution, his pride bruised but intact. But something still pulled at Miss Marple's thoughts, an itch just beyond her reach. The case had resolved itself too cleanly. Vivian had confessed to motive, the gloves had been found, the bottle recovered, and Lionel Lake had spoken with convincing fear of his estranged wife's ability to deceive. And yet, despite all that, something still felt off. It wasn't Vivian's guilt that troubled her, it was the rhythm of the crime itself. She sat one morning at her breakfast table with her notebook, combing once again through the sequence of events. Caroline Ashworth had known something. She had hidden the gloves, and bottled with care, even turned the book backwards to mark it. But there was something else. Something about the timing. Vivian hadn't poisoned Caroline in a moment of passion or anger. She had arrived, calm and composed, ready to carry out a plan. But Caroline, a meticulous woman, had written the diary entry that same morning. Tea with the widow. Odd name, but pleasant enough. She knew about my violets. That line had always seemed innocuous. But the mention of the violets had never sat well with Miss Marple. She rose abruptly and crossed to the shelf, pulling down the book Caroline had once used to catalogue her gardening notes. Inside, pressed between pages, were old notes and flower specimens, some dried, some labelled. She found the entry about the violets quickly. Caroline had written, "Replanted from Edward's cousin's estate, rare alpine cuttings, keep in, shade, blooms late March." Vivian couldn't have known about them. She'd never been in the garden, not once. Miss Marple's pulse ticked faster. She sat again, reviewing everything, Vivian's knowledge of the violets, the missing silver, bottle, and the rare book that had surfaced so early after Caroline's death. Vivian had never entered the house after the crime. She had fled, but the bottle had not been with her. It had remained in the parlour until it was hidden, unless someone else had placed it there after the fact. She remembered Edward. Pale, nervous, arriving the day after the death and insisting only that he'd come to collect a few things. At the time, it had seemed innocent. Now it felt rehearsed, too casual. And then there was the page of botanical notes, discovered, in the potting shed. Vivian hadn't planted it. She hadn't known the book existed. but Edward had. Miss Marple stood, moving to her writing desk and drawing out the statement Edward had given to Sergeant Braxton. He had claimed to have visited Caroline the week before her death, claimed not to have spoken about the will, claimed he'd left after a short visit. But Miss Marple remembered now that Mrs. Headley, the butcher's wife, had seen Edward the very morning of Caroline's death, early, before tea, near the post office, carrying a box. Said he was dropping it at his aunt's, she'd told someone after the funeral. Said it was something she'd forgotten. That box had never been found. The remark had seemed too mundane to chase down then. Now it echoed. She rang the inspector. By midday, they were seated once more in the Ashworth parlour, dust motes swirling in the light through the drawn curtains. Miss Marple held the green book in her lap, though the contents had already been removed. The inspector listened as she recounted her concern, not with Vivian's guilt, but with Edward's involvement. He was always one step behind the action, she said, just enough to appear harmless. But he knew about the rare book, the gloves, the potting shed, and he had the best motive of all, financial desperation. But Vivian confessed, the inspector reminded gently. She admitted to the motive. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, the emotional motive, the identity, but not the timing. She meant to kill Caroline. That's true, but she didn't. Someone else got there first. Silence settled between them. The inspector stood. I'll have him brought in. Edward arrived, confused but cooperative. He sat in the same chair Vivian had, hands on his knees. What's this about now? I thought it was over. Miss Marple watched him closely. Tell me again, Edward. Where were you the morning Caroline died? He blinked. I told you. I was at the house the day before. No, Miss Marple said softly. You were seen that morning, with a parcel. His jaw tightened. Well? Yes, all right, I was. I brought her some magazines. I didn't think it mattered. And you left them in the house? Yes. Did she take tea with you? No, I left it at the door. She was in the garden. Miss Marple's voice lowered. Then how do you know she was still alive? Edward hesitated. She was found in the parlour, with no trace of anyone else entering. And yet somehow the teacup was clean, the room was undisturbed, and the gloves were already gone. Vivian never had a chance to touch anything, but someone had a key, someone familiar, someone Caroline would not question. Edward's mouth opened, then shut again. She left that diary entry, Miss Marple continued, but it wasn't from that day. The ink was older. You used it. You copied her handwriting and planted it to mislead us. He rose suddenly, face flushed. She was going to cut me out. Everything to charity, for widows and violets and blasted botanists. I only meant to frighten her, but she wouldn't back down. And then Vivian. Well, she was perfect, wasn't she? She'd already lied. Already running. The inspector moved swiftly, gripping Edward's arm before he could move. So, you let her take the fall, he said coldly. I thought she did. It, Edward muttered. At first, after the papers picked it up. Then I realized she never made it past the gate. Miss Marple stood slowly. You weren't just hiding behind her. You relied on her being guilty. That's the cleverest kind of criminal, Edward. The one who doesn't need to lie, only wait for someone else's truth to speak first. Edward said nothing more. Later, Miss Marple returned home, her steps deliberate, her mind quiet. The case had closed twice now, once on performance and once on presumption. It had taken every ounce of patience to see that Vivian's guilt had only been a curtain behind which the real crime had waited. She passed her shelf, ran a hand along the spines, and stopped at the green book. She did not open it. Some stories, once resolved, must simply remain closed. The trial of Edward Ashworth was held quietly, far from the reach of newspapers eager for dramatic headlines. The name of Caroline Ashworth carried too much social weight, and the authorities wished to protect her legacy from unnecessary scandal. The Crown laid out its case: the altered diary entry, the false timeline, the forged handwriting, the rare book sold under a faked identity, and finally, the confession Edward had made, not in court, but before Miss Marple and the inspector, once he believed there was no path left but the truth. He admitted to entering the house early that morning, knowing Caroline would be alone, intending only to plead with her, perhaps persuade her to rethink the will. But when she refused, he saw his chance. The gloves were already in the drawer. From Vivian's visit the week before, the bottle still on the mantel, unnoticed by both women. He used what had been meant for another. Vivian Lake remained in custody, but her case never reached court. The Crown dropped the murder charge once Edward's confession was verified. She was charged instead with obstruction and false identity, serious but survivable. She did not contest them. She simply nodded, accepted the conditions of her release, and left the courtroom in silence. She would never return to Chipping-Dean. She understood as clearly as Miss Marple had all along that her performance had ended the moment Caroline. Ashworth refused to lie. Miss Marple, when asked to give her statement, did so in her usual quiet way. No drama, no flair. She simply explained what had been seen and what had been missed, the gloves that never vanished, only hidden by the victim herself. The backward-placed book, which no one else had thought to turn, the faint trace of violet pollen on Edward's sleeve, long ignored as nothing more than garden dust, and, most notably, the handwriting in the diary, which had been a copy of Caroline's, not a true entry. He assumed that Caroline's daily habit would be mistaken for her final word, Miss Marple said calmly. But handwriting is like tone. I've known hers long enough to hear the difference. The courtroom, usually a place of stern echo and tension, was silent when she finished. No gasps, no theatrics, just quiet recognition. Afterward, the inspector walked Miss Marple back to the station. We might have locked up the wrong person. Forever, if not for you, he said without flourish. It was neat, clean, too clean. Miss Marple offered a slight smile. Crimes committed by clever people often are. But cleverness doesn't erase conscience. It only delays it. Edward had time to stop himself. He didn't. Vivian, for all her lies, never lifted a hand. The inspector gave a short nod. And yet she'll never truly walk free. No, Miss Marple said softly. But neither will Edward. One will be watched by others. The other will carry the eyes of the dead. They parted outside the station gate. Miss Marple declined the ride. She preferred the walk. As she passed the small post office, she saw young Len seated on the steps, whittling a bit of wood into the shape of a bird. He looked up and gave a small wave. All sorted, miss? As sorted as it ever gets, she replied. But as she turned into her lane, a faint unease still lingered. Not doubt. The case had been solved. Justice, in the letter of the law, had been served. But there were wounds beneath it all that would not heal as neatly. She reached her gate and paused, glancing toward the empty cottage where Vivian had once lived. The shutters were drawn now, ivy beginning to reclaim the fence. Missy. Marple had never feared ghosts of the supernatural kind, but she knew something of the other sort, the ones that walk in memory, in regret, in unresolved silence. She made tea that afternoon and sat down with her knitting. The wool was soft, and her fingers moved as if of their own accord. But her mind lingered on something else he had said before leaving town. The girl had decided not to return to service. I just want to be somewhere quiet, she'd said, where no one asks me what I saw. It had reminded Miss Marple that crime doesn't vanish with the culprit. It lingers, in habits broken, in conversations avoided, in the quiet turn of a key in a lock that used to be left open. Still, there was comfort in clarity. She opened her drawer and drew out the green book once more. Its hollow was empty now, the gloves and bottle long since sealed into evidence. But she traced its edge with a kind of fondness, not for the object itself, but for the reminder that the truth was always there, sometimes turned spine inward, sometimes folded into silence, but waiting nonetheless. And in Chipping Dean, as the weeks wore on, life resumed. The butcher reopened with a new assistant. The vicar composed his sermons again without glancing nervously toward the congregation, and the people, slowly and cautiously, began to speak Caroline Ashworth's name once more, not with fear, but with memory. There was no parade, no reward, no grand announcement, just a quiet acknowledgement passed from neighbour to neighbour. Miss Marple had seen what they hadn't, not because she was cleverer, but because she listened and watched and waited, and so justice came. Not as vengeance, not as triumph, but as clarity, and in the quiet that was enough. The summer deepened around Chipping Dean, and with it came a kind of subdued warmth that seemed to settle the dust of recent events into the seams of the village, like a book carefully closed but never forgotten. Caroline Ashworth's cottage was taken over by a charity trust she had quietly arranged in her final weeks, and a woman from Surrey moved in to manage the estate's small educational fund for young girls, a detail Caroline had never spoken of publicly, but one that spoke volumes of the woman behind the lace curtains and well-kept garden. Miss Marple was invited for tea during the house's reopening, and she accepted, if only to glance once more at the room where the green book had sat on the shelf, quietly cradling secrets no one had meant it to hold. She stood a moment by the window in the parlour. The armchair had been moved. The new occupant had replaced the dark floral drapes with something lighter. The wallpaper had been scrubbed, the smell of beeswax now stronger than old violets. Still, a trace of something remained, memory perhaps, not sorrow exactly, but the echo of it, like the way a melody continues in the mind after the last note has faded. Miss Marple thanked her host, gave a polite compliment about the tea blend, and walked back through the garden path, past the patch where the foxgloves had grown. They had been pulled, the soil freshly turned. No one wanted reminders of poison among the roses. But it wasn't the flowers she was thinking of. It was a letter. A week prior, it had arrived quietly in her post. No return address, just a short note in simple, even script. You saw more than anyone else, even me. Thank you for being kind when you didn't have to be. I'm going south. I won't be back. I never wanted to kill her. That's the part you guessed right. But I did come with the thought. I think you knew that too. Miss Marple hadn't shown the note to the inspector. There was no threat in it, no boasting, no plea for sympathy, just the strange, plain weight of an unresolved thought. She hadn't burned it. She kept it folded in her drawer beneath her sewing patterns, unread by anyone else. She told herself she hadn't shown it because it changed nothing. But there was another reason, deeper and harder to articulate, something she didn't entirely want to name, because the case was finished. Edward had confessed. Vivian had walked away, unpunished by law perhaps, but not unmarked. And yet there were still things that had never been spoken, things Caroline never wrote down. And most unsettling of all, things Vivian never explained, like the letter she had supposedly written to herself the week before the murder, found torn up in the bin behind her cottage, half a page, water-stained, but the inspector had thought it nothing, a discarded note. Miss Marple had kept a portion of it. If they find out who I used to be, it all collapses. She saw the file. She never said, but I could tell. She looked at me that day in the grocer's, just one look, and I knew it was over. The file. Miss Marple had thought long and hard about that word. What file? Caroline Ashworth had kept. Meticulous records, yes, but not of village gossip. She wasn't the sort to dig into someone's past unless given cause. And yet Vivian had spoken of it as though Caroline had done exactly that. Found a file. Recognized her. The logical answer had always been that Caroline had remembered Vivian from the Wiltshire Hotel years ago. That she'd put the pieces together. But something about that had never sat right. Caroline hadn't been in Wiltshire in over a decade, according to her maid and the vicar's wife. She hadn't travelled beyond Hampshire in recent years, not since her arthritis flared, and yet she'd known Vivian's real name. Miss Marple stepped into her sitting room and lit the small reading lamp. The day had dimmed, but she hadn't drawn the curtains yet. The light threw a soft pool over her desk, where her knitting sat untouched. She reached into the drawer and pulled out the half-page again. The handwriting was Vivian's, and the ink had run slightly from moisture, but the phrasing was clear. She saw the file. If it hadn't been Caroline's file, then whose? Miss Marple thought back to Edward's early visits, before the will, before the argument, before Vivian had ever arrived. And then she remembered, vividly now, a conversation in the grocer's. Edward, speaking with Mr. Treadwell, had mentioned a cousin from London who worked in records. Tried to help me find a solicitor's archive. Wanted to know if the inheritance was worth bothering with. That was before the murder. Before Vivian was even a name anyone knew. A small remark passed off as idle curiosity. But it wasn't idle. It was targeted. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her hands motionless. Edward had found something. A file. Perhaps while pretending to look into his aunt's will, he had stumbled across records, an old court report, a marriage certificate, even a police document. And he had seen Vivian Lake for who she was before she ever arrived in Chipping Dean. What if he had invited her, not explicitly, but subtly, enough to make it seem like a coincidence, a shared acquaintance, a kind word passed through mutual friends? What if Edward had seen an opportunity, a woman on the run from her past, with every reason to keep her identity hidden? What if he had known exactly what kind of trouble might follow her into the village? Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it gently back in the drawer. There was no proof, no certainty, no confession. But the pattern, however faint, had formed once more. Edward had wanted Caroline dead. That had been clear. But perhaps he hadn't always planned to kill her himself. Perhaps he had hoped someone else would, someone who needed her silence more than he did. And when that failed, he acted. Vivian had walked into a trap, but so had Caroline. And now they had both vanished from the village, one beneath stone, the other into shadow, while the man who had started it all sat in a cell, not quite alone in his guilt. Miss Marple stared out the window. A robin landed on the sill, peered in, then fluttered away. The air was still, the streets quiet, but a mystery she knew never truly ended. It simply folded itself into another, and when it was ready, it would turn up again, spine outward, resting on a shelf.